All right, welcome to Earth Central, everybody. Today's guest is Reza Asmi. He's the executive director of Wild Asia and a self described dreamer and fermenter who is fascinated by natural ecosystems. Wild Asia is a social enterprise that's headquartered in Malaysia, focusing on the conservation of natural areas in support of local communities and smallholders that are dependent on natural resources, such as palm oil, which is one of the big topics that we want to be discussing with him today. Welcome to Earth Central, Reza, and it's nice to have you.
Yes. Thanks very much, Alex.
So we always start this off basically in the same way, and that's just for you to kind of introduce yourself to our audience, right? Like your path, how you came to build Wild Asia, and then the second part also just tell us a little bit about Wild Asia, what you're doing, what's currently going on,
Right.
anything that you see fit that the audience should know about you and Wild
Okay.
Asia.
Yeah, I guess in a nutshell, because otherwise I'll go on and on.
It's okay.
So anyway, I'm Reza Asmi, and I was born in Malaysia. I don't have a very Malaysian accent, partly because I've been overseas a lot and I moved a lot. But I studied in the UK. Um, but I made a decision just about, maybe right after graduation that I wanted to do something in the conservation world, but I didn't want to do it from Europe. So this idea of going back to Malaysia and, volunteering. And at that time, I had my dream job, which was, essentially, as a young graduate, to be given a little bit of money to go off to Borneo to study the forest was a dream job. And so that's really how I started. And and that field time working, you know, I guess on that interface between looking at forests and now you're talking the 1990s, um, and how communities were using these forests. So kind of opened me up to what happens to knowledge about natural areas, forests, species, how that disappears over time. Also realizing that the elders that I was talking to were really like essentially the last of those forest users because they grew up and they earned income by working in forest camps. And so they spent a lot of their time in forest camps. And fast forward to the 1990s, those forest camps were no more.
Mhm.
You saw this change in terms of forest environment to an agriculture environment. So a lot of oil palm development was happening in the 1990s. And then I saw contradiction. So I also saw there was then this sort of growth of ecotourism. So people were coming to this part of Borneo and they were looking at wildlife and they were getting excited. But then I knew that the landscape was changing because all of that forest area was disappearing. There was then more oil palm, and it almost felt like here was the last of
Mhm.
natural biodiversity, and these tourists were the last to see it. And I would say last because maybe they would hang on for a while, but as I progressed in my work, I was then visiting essentially forest areas in a sea of oil palm and realizing that although there used to be a lot of life in these forests, it was silent today because of that fragmentation. So species do disappear over time,
Mhm.
and it's just not a lot of people pay attention to this. Um, so this is a long kind of just, I guess, some background to
Mhm.
my context because so this was my personal history.
Mhm.
And so when we founded Wild Asia, we said, is there another way of doing this? Because I had by that time about 5 or 6 years working with a large, sort of green NGO, and we spent a lot of time writing proposals and trying to lobby governments to do something. But then I realized that, maybe the private sector was the sector we needed to be addressing. And rather than sit on the outside and scold them, how could we essentially interface with them and educate them? So I guess that was how we started with Palm. But again, it's not, sort of, no one would come to Reza and say, I want to study something about conservation and agriculture, but it's because we understood or we studied the RSPO. So in those days, oil palm had a gold standard, which was the Roundtable for Sustainable Oil Palm. So a bunch of people worked a long time to develop standards. So and that was the baseline of what sustainable palm oil should look like. And so by understanding this, we would, our focus very much was on how does one implement, and that was really like the foundation for Wild Asia in oil palm. And 15 years later, we're kind of still there in this space, but it's evolved a bit, I think, from the early days.
Yeah, very cool. And so, how would you say, like, how has the journey kind of gone? Like, it started with the RSPO as a foundation. How has the work, like Wild Asia's work, kind of evolved, right, from the starting point to today?
Yeah, I think the big difference was maybe about 10 years ago. We decided to extend our work from not just working with the big corporates, but realizing that the corporates had communities and forests around them. So how does one create a program that you could extend out to smallholders? And so we went out to, it was like an unknown path because there was there were no smallholders certified under RSPO in the early days. And we helped pioneer some of the very first groups to be RSPO certified. Um, and I think that experience took us in a slightly different pathway because it wasn't about complicated procedures and policies because it doesn't matter to a smallholder. Um, and so we started looking at like how do we make sustainability relevant? And I think that was a good sort of good track because eventually we realized that, and something that I forgot, which was how much biodiversity was so important to all life. And it started with, initially just how does farming work without chemicals when the industry only knows that if you remove nutrients from a farm, you have to return it with inorganic uh, chemicals. And that's the basis behind industrial agriculture. So with smallholders, we had a space to try other means. And the inspiration for them came from other natural farmers around the world, and especially in Asia and Japan and Korea, because they were fermenters, and so they are so used to using fermented products. And then with COVID, I then went a bit crazy because I could then go back in time to look at literature 100 years ago and started to study a bit more, and then just that eureka moment, and that probably at that point I realized, holy shit, it's like all life is dependent on bacteria and fungi, even humans. And so I think once you understand that, you start realizing how what you eat and how this interacts with this microorganisms is as important as what you put in the farm in the form of organic matter. And so I think this is kind of like, I started seeing these parallel universes, and then like the dreamer in me then started realizing how, wow, it's like if everybody can think this way, then you have communities who are building, and then you've got this, the whole, these dreams of circular economy just make sense, because at some point you realize all, I mean, it's, like in my garden, it's the same. Like all waste just ends up in somewhere in the garden. So and that was something important to teach. So that really became the focus of our work, really, and I'm glad, because I think it's now opening up a whole new, maybe not so much a whole new mission, but I think there's some clarity now about what we are trying to do, and that's about bringing this knowledge and trying to see how we can leverage on businesses to not just think about consumption, but how can they create new kinds of circular loops which reward or support or build this regenerative movement at the
Mhm.
farm level and then at the community level, etc. And I kind of basically see a pathway for that now.
Awesome. That's really cool. Yeah, and so basically, this kind of this time that you spent really understanding more about bacteria fermentation and implementing that, if I understand it correctly, became the base of how you're working with smallholders now. You're basically teaching them these practices so that they can implement that on their farms.
Correct. And
Um,
it started, simply with a few farms in Malaysia.
mhm,
And I just came back from Kalimantan, where some people
mhm,
had come to one of our sites. They learned the methods, and then they went back to their communities and were then teaching these farmers. And then it's really nice to see, like, this, how this model can extend. And now we have plots, across Sabah, different
mhm.
parts of Peninsular Malaysia. We have some operations in Thailand, like, this is starting to scale up. There's some work in Indonesia with these different groups in
Mhm.
Sumatra and Kalimantan. So just that idea that, maybe it is something as simple as understanding and spreading this knowledge, which was important. We're still learning how to do that, obviously, because, we're not trained. I pause. It is probably a blessing that we're not trained as agronomists or as professional extension agents, because we realize maybe you need to be a bit more flexible in how these things
Mhm.
need to be
Mhm.
evolved and communicated. But anyway, so the point is, it starts small, but that we can see some movement. That it is growing, and then just a few days ago, I get this email about trying to take this to Peru. So it's like,
Cool.
holy
Wow.
shit!
Wow. That's amazing. That's really cool. So that's brand new, basically.
That's like, tabula rasa and all that, So yeah.
Oh, I love that. That's really cool. Man, that's exciting. Yeah, I mean, okay, because that was actually going to be my follow-up question. Like, how has it scaled so far? You know, do you have like how many farmers are you working with? Do you even know?
No,
Or
no, no.
is
Yeah, I mean, like, the core. So the idea is still, we help support a core group of farmers, and if you think about them like ripples, so it's, so there's a core where I have field teams on the ground, and
Mhm,
we have direct relationships with these different farmers. Uh, all of them are within a RSPO program, so basically it's organized. It's an expensive certification program we run, and then we try and raise money through different ways to essentially cover the operations.
mhm,
Part of it is to do with grants from the brands. So there's lots of different companies who are supporting this program. So
mhm,
that's the core. Then you have these ripples that flow out. So, for example, with some of these ASEAN partners in Thailand and Indonesia, we made a commitment that, we want to teach you. Either we can, if you have money, you can come and visit, and we'll download everything. Everything is kind of like that open source mindset. Um, and then the important part is that if there is money, or if we have money, or if we can raise some money, then it's usually good that we can kind of visit your site, because that helps us fine tune practices, help close up any gaps in people's understanding. But we can kind of then see that that next phase is very much about capacity building the
Mhm.
next lead farmer in another region, because that person or lady is going to be the role model for a new
Mhm.
generation of farmers in that space. And so that's been the way forward. So our core group is now sitting on 32,000 hectares.
Wow.
So it's not
Wow.
small.
Yeah. It must be
So
amazing. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah. So so that's like our current scope. So then we're trying to think about, like, how does one leverage local businesses
Hmm.
to help create these, to extend that bio knowledge so that
Hmm.
we can start to convert that 32,000. So then we become a sizable force of practitioners who are all doing different things, but aiming towards, what is a kind of biodiversity friendly farm. So,
Hmm.
so I think that in some ways it's good. Like, so we have core partners who help us with that 32,000, that operational thing. Then after that is all little bits of grants that help us. Sometimes we have actually also everything seems to happen a few days ago, so maybe that's why I'm so busy. So then there's somebody saying, we can help you with the agroforestry bit. So that enhances some of our work because we don't have expertise in this.
Hmm.
And then also I realized, it's not just about planting material, but then also how does that link to market? And then you realize that's a whole other ball game, because you can encourage people to have diversity in their farms, but who's going to buy their products? So there's only so much you can do in terms of it helps the soils, but obviously it's better if you can increase or stack income streams onto these farmers.
Yeah. So I just want to pause for a second because it must be amazing to see it grow like this. And one of the things that is just important for the listeners to understand is that so the palm oil industry is such an important source of livelihoods in Southeast Asia. I saw, and this number is might be a year or two old, but like the from this is from a New York Times article that actually had quoted you, and there they're saying that about 4.5 million people in Malaysia and Indonesia are working in the palm oil industry in one way or another. And I think, and maybe you can talk a little bit about this, a big chunk of the palm oil industry is smallholder farmers.
Uh, a- Actually, it's a bit of a contradiction,
Okay.
um, because it is very regional. If I'm in Africa and okay, so globally we're talking about, I think it was like 21 million hectares of oil palm globally. But depending on your region, and now I realize depending on the colonial legacy of a particular region, you will find that the production would be either smallholder base or company base.
Mm-hmm.
And in some region, that company base can be as huge size that it becomes, essentially as a listed company, a corporate company.
Mm-hmm.
So, so good example, Thailand. So
Mm-hmm.
Thailand has never had, and no one conquered Thailand. So 80, 90% of production is smallholders.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And then the contrast is Malaysia. So Malaysia was colonized.
Mm-hmm.
And we had only some regions with complicated customary uh, land, but this allowed the state to allocate land to private individuals. This whole process of alienation, and so you had larger chunks, and those larger chunks became even larger chunks.
Hmm.
So actually, it's in Malaysia, it's the opposite of Thailand. There's actually more corporate slash company owned production, and
Hmm.
smallholders represent something like 40%.
Okay.
But most of that is sitting under managed smallholders. In other words, it's another government scheme.
Uh-huh.
And then
Okay.
there's only a small fraction of this is smallholders. So
Hmm.
numbers about, how many people are involved, how much of this is smallholders is very, I wouldn't say nuanced, but you have to
Hmm.
be clear where you're talking about, and it's easy to kind of simplify things.
Hmm. Hmm.
But that's kind of like the situation. And I think the context behind what we're doing, if you think about if 5 million hectares, and that's a sizable land area in Malaysia is covered by oil palm, and if most of that is industrial oil palm, because it's managed as a company, so monoculture, heavy
Hmm.
use of fertilizer, heavy use of glyphosate and those types of chemicals. Um, the idea that these smallholder trials and these things that we're doing on the fringe, if people learn that this is relevant for the big players and people start to put time to really learning from this and being inspired by this, which we're starting to get some attention,
Hmm.
then this idea of transforming 5 million hectares over the next 10 or 20 years is super exciting.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the context which I wanted to say, because if we just focused on the smallholders, yes, there's a livelihood component, and yes, you will be able to change people's lives, but it will be better if you can also transform the businesses which are surrounding them, and they have a much bigger impact on all ecosystems.
Hmm.
The waterways that flow through those communities, the forest areas in a particular area. So I'm just trying to think about how can we build that momentum around the small guys, the big guys, and then ultimately, how do we get the guys who are or the people who are consuming at the end of the spectrum, so that they see their role in influencing the way palm oil could be sourced. So maybe somebody could pay more, but rather than paying more through the supply chain, maybe they can support the projects on the ground, or maybe it can, there's just so many different ways of creating these opportunities where you can drive change at the ground level.
That's so interesting. And yeah, I mean, again, I see a lot of domino effects, or potential domino effects in the way you're describing it. Um, is it, when you started off, I think just to clarify a few things, also just for the audience to follow along. Um, Originally, when you started sort of the certification part for the RSPO, um, did you like basically the people you were working with in the beginning, they became certifiable under that scheme, but then later you introduced what you were discussing now, what came up during COVID, so that's an extra sustainability layer essentially, right? Like that makes
Correct.
the approach even better. So that is technically something that goes beyond the requirements of what the RSPO does, I would assume.
Yeah, no, so exactly. I mean, like some people might say, oh, this is beyond certification. But I think basically what I realized is if you can have a producer who can do many things, that makes them not just more like lower risk from many
Mhm.
different perspectives, but also irresistible. So you want him in or her in your supply base. So how do we create that? And I could create that if the mill, which is the point where most people That's where large volumes are sort of aggregated.
Hmm.
If I can make the mill irresistible, then that's going to attract the buyers to want that mill's oil in their procurement. So this is kind of like
Hmm.
the simple logic is like, how do I just make it so compelling?
Hmm.
Uh, and then that increases everybody's revenue, which means that if you have things to solve, there's money available. But I can
Hmm.
tell you in the current system, the farmers, especially the slightly larger farmers, have taken on so much debt that they don't have enough spare change. So after paying their workers, after, trying to keep some money in the bank, they have no more money. And then you come to them and say, look, you need to upgrade your this facility, you need to pay your workers more. There's no more money in the system. And then you go to like the marketplace, and then the marketplace say, no, they should be sustainable. We're not going to pay them more to be sustainable. So then where are you going to get that extra value? So you can, so hence, where we sat, we said, well, maybe if we can cut your cost of production. So if you can take out those expensive chemical inputs, maybe that's one way.
Hmm.
But then we just realized when you take that out, your carbon footprint also drops.
Hmm.
And now you have something which the brands would say, oh, you have low carbon footprint. Maybe I want you in because that will lower my scope 3 emission, for example. So two different things have different meanings for either the brand side or the consumers of palm oil, but then more importantly, trying to find something that would make sense for the farmer. So now I have less production, I have more income. Can we create some extra value through that lower carbon footprint? And that's really what we're working on now. So this idea that once people see that there's value to move in a certain direction, would you want to turn back? Or, so
Hmm.
that's what we're trying to unlock.
That's amazing. And you answered my next question basically already because I wanted to ask you, how do you convince them?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
But actually, it's
do,
it's not so much we're hopeless with convincing. So what we do, and I'll be very serious because what you realize is when your mindset is geared up towards what you have learned from your peers and the industry and what have you, you will always come to the table and say what you're doing is either irresponsible, the system will collapse, which I've heard from, like deans of some big European university when I presented. I was a bit shocked. I was like, what do you mean systems will collapse? um, and then you have things like, oh, where's your nutrients going to come from? Because NPKs are so important. So things like that. People come to the table with all kinds of baggage. So we tend to work by demonstration. So you come and learn, and we'll help you do a demonstration. But ultimately, we want you to see that there's value in doing this, and so that's the basis behind what we've been trying to do.
and do you think it's been like, I mean, you have managed to get to 32,000 hectares and some interest from Latin America now too. So clearly, some things are working. Do you feel it's a, you know, is this is it difficult to make the case, like, or do you feel that a lot of the farmers or the companies are actually receptive to it? Yeah, how do you feel?
I think I guess maybe what it is it's about time, and realizing that we need to have more conversations with the procurement department,
Hmm.
not with the sustainability department. So this idea that, oh, actually, we need both of them. So we kind of need to show, if you do this, we can give you your scope 3 emissions value, or your nature positive value, or your smallholder value, whatever indicator sustainability wants to report. But I need procurement to make that decision. I want this oil at this price, and this, sometimes there's a premium and sometimes there isn't. But basically, obviously, you need something a little bit extra. So to get procurement and sustainability on the same platform, it doesn't happen with every company. So, but I think I found that I get things moving when procurement is leading the conversation, than sustainability. So that's quite revealing to me. I mean, I think this idea that, we do need to sit with businesses more, but not just businesses, the right decision makers. And then obviously having management who recognizes that a little bit extra we pay delivering on sustainability results is a good thing, is also then another blessing. So if you know, or if anybody out there meets this criteria, then come and get in touch with us, because I think that's what we need. I think that's the hardest thing, is trying to find and navigate the sea of folks. But in some ways, I think what's been good is that, in the early days, a lot of companies came to us for training on what is RSPO standards and stuff. And I think that experience helps, because then we built relationships with traders, with different buyers. So that helps us kind of broker some of these conversations. But definitely that's where we need to be, in order for us to make that transition from smallholders to estates, and really showing how this can scale.
Yeah, and that's of course one of the hopes of having this conversation, is that for both sides we benefit from the right people hearing what we're talking about. So that's very much true. For all the procurement officers out there, this is a great this is a
Yeah,
great
and
thing to.
actually, if you think about the like EUDR, I mean, this is what it's opening up, because basically you're starting to, like have tools which are more available to both procurement and sustainability, so that you're talking around the same page. I mean, so to speak. So, if you have a supplier list, the other fella can tell you, is this risky or not? And so you want to shift your procurement towards less risky. But knowing who those suppliers are is the missing link. And that's really where we sit. So when we see supplier lists, I can say this person is a good fellow. This one is a great fellow. Because you know them from history, or other people's impression. So then you find that actually a high risk supplier on paper may be a low risk and progressive palm oil supplier, and that's who you want to work with. So I think, it's great that there are these remote sensing platforms and what have you, but I think what it misses is an understanding about who you're ultimately buying from when you are looking at mill lists, which everyone does, it's all freely available, but no one has a rating system that is, like 3 smiley faces for this guy, or 1 frowned, and then 1, kind of angry face for another, so that's what people need.
Yeah, I mean, this is some really critical, I think, nuanced information. Yes, and you're right. We have, it's funny because with us, we face a little bit of a similar challenge in it from a different side, right? Like we also are constantly trying to find the right people to talk to say why the solution that they like. We feel there are a lot of people who would like our solution, but they need to see it.
Yeah.
And I think so. I think I can relate that. You know, you're offering something very unique. You're offering you the insights that I think are very unique. Um, and you just mentioned the EUDR, and this is where I was, of course, going to steer the conversation at some point anyway. Um, so for your work, there have been these traditional or former certification schemes. And that was sort of how I guess the world was looking at like RSPO. That means that's where there's resources of sustainable, what is certified as sustainable palm oil. Now there's this new regulation coming in Europe, where there's a lot of the consumption of the palm oil happening. And uh, do you feel that yeah, like what is your take on it? Do you feel that the EUDR has made your work easier or more difficult, or both maybe, given what it demands, but at the same time that it also provides this pressure, I imagine, right? Like now companies probably feel more pressure to actually find sustainable um, uh, uh, palm oil sources. I don't know, how do you see it? It would be interesting from somebody who has a lot more information, actually seeing things on the ground. How has the lead up to the EUDR actually affected that sector?
Right. I mean, I think from my side, it's like we've been ready. I mean,
Hmm.
polygons of farmers from day one, we had them.
Hmm.
Um, and then are they EUDR compliant? It's just a matter of a land cover layer to be added into, so it's actually been something for 10 years we've been doing this. So it's not
Yeah.
complicated. So I think the biggest change is that the industry is now realizing how important traceability is and realizing that the traceability was really about farm to mill level, but also how does that information flow to the refiner and to his buyers? Because his buyers are the ones who are going to make that declaration. It's not the mill. Sometimes it's not the refiner. It's the trader who buys from the refiner. It's the customer that buys from the refiner. He's going to make that, or he or she is going to have to make that declaration. So what I've realized with EUDR, the problem has been how do you package this information across these supply chain divides? And how do you make it such that it's a two-way conversation? Because I see the way that corporates are addressing this is there's this mad rush to collect information,
Hmm.
but it's one dimensional. As soon as I have your polygon, it's like, wow, I'm so excited. And now I can tell them, my buyers, I have this and they do that. But they forget that it's a dynamic environment. You need a
Hmm.
two-way conversation because now that guy has sold his land to somebody else. And you don't know if you don't have a two-way conversation. So, so I think this is partly the industrial model means that everything flows in one dimension. And on our side, it's starting to open up conversations where people do see the value in having two-way conversations with Wild Asia, who acts as an interface between the mill and the dealer and his farmers, and that level of complexity. So it's definitely opened up, um, that kind of value chain, uh, of, kind of conversations. But I think what I need more is just more experience with this and more companies realizing that they need to be friendly with us and also they need to think about new ways of doing supplier engagement and recognizing that, we are part of the equation. Um, and another outcome of this is then the smallholders are included in an RSPO program, which is what we do. So they get access to knowledge as well. And then we have a captive audience to introduce our bio program to. So, we see a way of transforming the industry, and it's not just about meeting a compliance issue, but telling this to companies is the hard part,
Yeah.
especially now it's not just the brands, but it's now the local businesses. And often that's where that's the next challenge for us.
Mhm. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, at the end of the day, our experience is a little bit a company is interested in meeting whatever is required of them so that they can go on um, being a company, right? And I think one of some of the news that I've seen around the EUDR is that yeah, I think the most criticism I see about the regulation is that in certain commodity sectors, at least, there is a concern about that it doesn't really address the needs of the smallholder suppliers. I guess in your case, the benefit is that you have been working with them for such a long time already that, as you said, you're people who are working with you are essentially ready for the EUDR, so they don't need to be worried. But on the larger scale, one of the things that I've come across is that there is just sort of a lack of information being passed on. Like it's already we're already seeing this, that there's still sustainability managers and like corporates in big corporations. There's still a lot of people responsible who they claim the regulation isn't clear enough, or they don't know enough. Which that's probably a point that can be debated until the end of time. But one of the things I've been seeing is that smallholders in a lot of different commodity sectors, and I don't know if it's true for palm oil as well, in a lot of cases are also saying that yeah, we haven't really heard of this, or we don't really have much information about this. Have you encountered that at all, where where you see that there's a lot of people working in this field and they don't really know what is the EUDR, what are the actual requirements, how will it affect me?
Yeah, I mean, let me put it in another way. If 10% of Malaysian palm oil is destined for the EU, you've got 90% of the market which is going elsewhere.
Mhm.
So communicating to all producers is obviously going to be a challenge, and you may not even do this. Um, so how do you satisfy that 10% demand is by having these large estates and corporate mills. So the big businesses have got organized, and
Mhm.
they're set up to meet this requirement. And so for one sector, there is no problem. So if you
Mhm.
ask that, the smallholder in the middle of nowhere who's disconnected to any of this sort of EU supply base, it's not a surprise that he doesn't know about EUDR, but people kind of make it out like it's a big deal.
Okay.
So I think there's a little bit of that in some cases. Uh,
Mhm.
then you've got this geopolitical lens to this. So people, I mean, especially governments, are saying this is unfair, and my smallholders are going to be affected. The whole industry is going to be affected. Um, but if you think about that 10% going already, and actually it's already okay, um, there is no problem. So
Okay.
you kind of just realize, there's like these layers of stuff.
Mhm.
Then on the consumer side, yeah, I mean, I think again, because people don't understand who the burden is on, the burden is on the importer. So
Hmm.
as long as you receive oil palm from an importer who's cleared the regulations, you're clear, I think. Isn't that how it works?
Hmm. Yeah.
So actually that misinformation is in some ways an opportunity for others, because then there's a whole bunch of people offering services on, I'll solve your EUDR problem. So I don't know. I mean, to be honest, then it gets a bit more complicated, just
Hmm.
like who's doing what and stuff. But um, I was listening to the DG of C4 in Bogor, in Indonesia, and it was interesting because basically they tracked, um, 2020, January 2020 is the EUDR cutoff point. And I think what I realized is that the focus on those five commodities, palm, cattle, etc., this
Hmm.
is a historical issue, which the regulation is now trying to stop. But actually, most production has already been converted before this point.
That's
What con-
interesting.
what conversion is happening after this point? And then you look at the top 3 to 4, and the very top of this is cashew nuts.
Hmm. 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 And yeah,
So,
yeah,
so it kind of shows
interesting.
you that, whilst people have worked a long time to kind of trying to stop something, uh,
Hmm.
it's so dynamic, or the momentum is so dynamic that you're not going to capture these things. So basically, his conclusion was EUDR is not going to stop deforestation because it's not nimble enough.
Hmm.
Um, the other thing, which, so then in the same conversation, we had some people from Latin America. So I was having this conversation about, I think it was Guatemala, and you have organized crime who's involved, and they're paying farmers to go and open up protected areas, and so that's deforestation. Then there's some ways that I don't know how that land converts into somebody's land, or somehow there's something which happens. So that would be a form of deforestation after the event. But if it's for cashew nut or any of these other things, it will be off the radar. If it was for oil palm, maybe it wouldn't meet the EUDR requirements. But the fact is that the primary motivator is this. There's different interest groups who are thinking that, you know, I'm just going to get the land first because I can transact this and make some money. And maybe a Guatemalan farmer in the middle of nowhere is not going to be making it into an EUDR supply chain. So you would still end up with deforestation
Hmm.
despite the regulation. So probably the critiques out there against EUDR regulation, I wouldn't say it's, I mean, the burdens and stuff, maybe some of that is a bit cooked up, but um, whether EUDR is really going to stop deforestation, I'm starting to think that, maybe not. And
Hmm.
maybe we do need other ways of solving this problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting insights because usually we see it over here so much from that European lens, and we think about the product that comes here, and we think about these things. But I think what you just said, like just to the explanation, for example, the 10% goes to the European market, but 90% goes elsewhere. That's a huge uh, that's an incredibly important piece of information, right? When you think about the actual power of the EUDR when we're looking at global deforestation,
Right.
and that's super interesting. And I think the only thing I know is that I think when they originally perceived the idea of the EUDR, I think that some of the people of the proponents also were hoping that this could be an inspiration for similar type of legislation or for follow-up kind of legislation in other places as well, which I guess looking at I don't know, a lot of things, the way the world is moving right now is maybe a very idealistic um, look at this, because I don't know if and I don't know if sustainability always takes the top priority in a lot of decisions that are being made right now economically, and it's probably also understandable to an extent. Um, but it is, but it gives this, what you said just really gives a really good kind of perspective, because we're always wondering, is the EUDR even going to survive, because we have also political forces, and of course also corporations and some political parties, and figures who are at least pushing. Some of them would like to delay it again. Like they brought out the classifications, the risk classifications for the different countries, and I think like a few days later, I think the Austrian government, Luxembourg, and some others were like, "Oh, we need to delay again," and I think they're not going to delay, from what my feeling is, but there are those voices still pushing, I think, for that, and we do wonder, also at Orbify, always, what is the long-term future of that regulation even, and how will it go. It's hard to say, it's hard to predict the future, but with these risk classifications, I remember, when they came out, I think, definitely the Malaysian government, for example, positioned themselves, and I think they were not happy with the classification, and I think that they were they were classified as standard risk, and then you compare it to some other countries and deforestation activity there, that is related to some commodities. Like, for example, Canada is a country that's a low risk country, but there's of course also a lot of deforestation happening, to due to the timber industry, for example, and timber is a commodity that's covered under the EUDR, of course. Um,
Yeah, yeah. But I think this whole thing with the risk assessment, maybe they screwed up there because they
mhm,
didn't make the criterias clear so that you can objectively evaluate a country's
mhm,
standing and why they got a certain score. And I think that was actually one of the weak parts of this. Actually, there's many weak parts, but just as I think that would have solved it. Just like how you would, if you're going to calculate your GHG emissions, you state your assumptions, you state your calculations, um, and people
mhm.
can look at that. They can repeat this. But if you can't repeat them, then it's easy to see that it just doesn't make any sense. I think like there was like only 6 high risk countries or yeah, like
They gave only 4 high risk classifications, and there are Russia, Belarus, North Korea, and Iran, and I there's a suspicion, at least, that, like, makes this seem maybe a little bit more political,
yeah,
than it should be. And I don't know, like, I haven't, as you just said, I haven't dug in and looked at the methodology, to make a, like, to say, like, oh, this makes sense or not. I know our EO engineer, he has gone in, and I think that from a scientific point of view, I think that he's quite impressed, actually, with the methodology, but that doesn't mean that it's complete, or nimble enough, and nuanced enough. Um, I absolutely don't know. But it is interesting, right? Like, there was this point, and that's what I was getting to. The classifications of countries, and when you look a little bit of how they stand in relation to the European market. Canada has a free trade agreement with the European Union, I'm pretty sure. And then I do wonder if some of the objections that are coming from countries like Malaysia are maybe maybe understandable to an extent, especially given that, I mean, also when you look at the historic point in time, um, if you look at the landscapes across Europe, we have basically like monoculture and like very very clearly not primary forest anymore in most of in most of the countries, and agricultural production is managed to a T, um, and now we're saying, yeah, this isn't like the primary kind of way that our economy works anymore. So but we really need to stop deforestation around the world. So now, if you want to
Yeah.
come and trade with us, right? So I think I understand from a historic point of view that different countries' economies are built very differently. And so if you
Well,
say,
I can tell you the
yeah,
contradictions. I mean, because basically you have forest that needs to be standing, and there's a valid reason why that should happen, and that needs to increase. But so I can understand where deforestation comes in. I
sure.
think that there needs to be more effort around carbon removals, but the way it's being proposed right now seems to be heavily onto CO2 capture and storage, which is linked to an industry which is actually going to increase CO2 emissions because that means there's more fossil fuels going to be available. So in some ways that's the crazy thing. So we're sort of
Hmm.
where we need to control, we seem to be rapidly expanding, thinking that this is the solution, when in fact that's going to cause just absolute chaos for everybody. If you think of the planetary boundaries, we went from, I don't know, like a few years ago was only 8 planetary boundaries we've surpassed, and now it's 9. And at which point have we, or was it 6, or now we're at 7? But anyway, I think we're close to coming to the last 2, and then that's it. It's like game over. So I think, this whole EUDR thing, maybe we've spent an enormous amount of time around it. But maybe the one that we should be paying attention to is carbon capture and release. I mean, carbon capture and storage. And that's a weak component I think that's something. The other one is, I think there still needs to be some effort around traceability, because I think as a basic requirement, if you don't know where your suppliers are from, that's going to be the difficulty in doing any sort of control or sustainability or procurement and that kind of stuff. So the blessing with EUDR is you have a lot more of this happening now in palm, but we need it for other commodities. But yeah, I think keep forests standing and more carbon removals in a natural way. But
Yeah.
time-wise, I have a 5 o'clock call.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah, I've got about maybe
That's
another 5 minutes.
yeah. That's okay. That's good. Yeah, I mean, this is this we're learning a lot of interesting things here, I think, through this conversation. I think then I would just get there's some things I always ask, and there, but before that, if you could give us a little bit of just like a rundown, like the work that you're doing, right? Like at the end of the day, there's also an economic calculation that I think actually, if smallholders work with you or if companies work with you in the long term, there's actually an economic benefit to being more sustainable. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, do you have sort of like a pitch or something that sort of drives that point home?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much a pitch, but I think
Yeah, yeah, just
I mean, what is very clear is we have a method we have credibility, and we have boots on the ground who have direct access to farmers, SMEs, and we have built up a reputation within this industry. Um, and I think what we need more than anything else is tools that will be able to help communicate this to more companies, that the work that we're doing is having an impact on nature, or uh, helping improve transparency, or there's carbon gains and things like that. So, I think if people could rally around tools which help in this way, and then work on their traceability connection, so then we could really look at how much of what we do can be scaled up by being included in value chains, then it could be interesting, because then we're not chasing like grants per se, but it's really growing it from within the value chain so that
Mhm.
this can really be sustainable.
Yeah, awesome. And on that journey, and this is a question I like to ask everybody who's been on this podcast, and then there's one more, and then I'll let you go. What do you think, like, because at the end of the day, we're a company that works in the technology space. What do you see about the role of technology? How could it help you? How do you see the role of technology in making all of this happen?
Yeah, I think we're already using, uh, we embrace technology a lot. So we have tech partners who have given us really not just cool tools, but just an like 1,000 member teams who are ready to like do stuff. Uh, but only because they know that we can deliver something with impact on the ground. So this idea that there are CSR programs within companies where they're saying, I'm not going to give you a grant, I'm not going to give you something for free, but I'll help you build it if you think that's useful and you can show that it's been used. And I think those kinds of partnerships are really powerful, because that enables us to not just work with a few hundred farmers, but we can do a few thousand. We can scale to new countries. We can go to Peru. And I wouldn't have had the confidence of doing that if it wasn't for technology partners.
Mhm.
In the same way that we've got Carbon Space is another company we work with, and that uses remote sensing data as a means of measuring net ecosystem exchange. And that's become quite an interesting tool, because it's very hard to measure or collect data to help you calculate farm emissions, because you need fertilizer records and chemical
Mhm.
records, and if they don't share it with you, then how do you know that it has been applied or hasn't been applied? So this idea that if you can measure your farm, then you have an objective way of showing whether you've gained or you're a constant emitter. So that's something that we've been testing out for the last 2 years, and we'll have the second round of data this year. So that's been a blessing, trying to get some of that kind of stuff in. But obviously, always looking at new ways of testing tools out. I think the two dimensions in my mind now are, how does eDNA and that kind of work, how could we integrate that into our program? Um, how do we, kind of leverage our polygons so that we can enhance nature in some ways? That's another dimension. I think a third dimension is a social one, like, how do we listen more to communities, to farmers, to workers, and then how do we do something about it so that we can really see this as a movement that makes things better rather than always hiding from compliance. And every time there's a problem, people just run away. Whereas, there's nowhere we can run, and we're not going to kick out farmers. So we rather work with them and see how to make things better.
Awesome. Thank you. So the last question, and I'll let you go with that, and we'll lead in already by saying thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it, and you're doing such amazing things. We're super happy to have always interesting guests like you, and I think this for us, I think also just for our team, will be a particularly interesting conversation to listen to, because yeah, it's just really interesting to get a little bit more of an insider take from someone who really also knows what's happening on the ground related to one of the commodities that really plays a big role in the EUDR and in the work that we're doing. I mean, our work also goes beyond the EUDR in sustainability monitoring and assessment. So this is super interesting. And so my last question to you, and I'll let you also finish with whatever you like, anything that you would like to add. But in that, one of the questions is just, to this point, what are you most proudest about or happiest about of, where your journey and Wild Asia's journey has gone or has come to?
Yeah, I think the confidence of knowing that nature knows best and being humble enough to realize that it can work in so many beautiful ways. So coming back to our biodiversity roots is important, and kind of realizing that, I guess that connection between life forms that you can't see. It's not extraterrestrial, but it's this bacteria and fungi, and how that's intertwined in our lives. I think that's been a recent realization. But yeah, I think that's something I'm proud that we've got to that point, because I can see that knowledge can transform people, communities, farming systems, and it does make things a better place.
Yeah, it really does. So I really appreciate it. If you have anything left, I know you have to go. But yeah, then so thank you so much for your time. And we'll be in touch. And I promised you some links I will send you. So
Sure.
we'll be in touch on email. I'll send you the recording and then you can take a look
All right.
if you like.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks a lot. Have a
Bye.
good day. Bye.